Hey there, my name is Sage and you are watching D&D Daily. Today I'm doing a viewer request video where Dahaka4444 asked me to do a blind stat block reading on the Carnivorous Ship. That comes from Tome of Beasts number 2. Before getting into the video, I want to talk about a kind of change that we're making here at D&D Daily regarding these blind stat blocks. I'm no longer going to go through a whole book and do every single one. I feel like there were too many that were just kind of dull. So what I'm doing is viewer requested stat blocks, as well as if I see any stat blocks that I feel like need to be more acknowledged in the community or just have really cool things going on about them, I'm also going to do those stat blocks. So you can expect fewer of these stat block readings, but each one should be a bit higher quality than they once were. Without further ado, let's jump into the Carnivorous Ship. The prow of this ship opens into a gigantic, tooth-filled maw, while humanoid-shaped blobs of flesh swarm over the rails. The Carnivorous Ship is bribable. It's a giant cousin to the Mimic. The Carnivorous Ship is a cunning hunter of the seas. Wise captains traveling through known Carnivorous Ship hunting grounds carry tithes and offerings to placate the creatures. They are solitary ship eaters. The Carnivorous ships live and hunt alone. Though they prefer to consume wood, metal, rope, and cloth, they aren't above eating flesh and readily eat entire ships, crew and all. They reproduce asexually after a season of particularly successful hunts. Young Carnivorous ships are about the size of rowboats and use the statistics of a mimic, except they also have one drone. As they age, they grow in size, eventually gaining more drones. Speaking of those drones, Carnivorous ships create vaguely humanoid drones from the flesh of their bodies. These drones are mindless and act under the mental direction of the Carnivorous Ship. From a distance, the drones appear to be a crew as they move about the deck of the Carnivorous Ship, but closer inspection reveals their true nature. When the Carnivorous Ship attacks another ship at sea, the drones swarm over the rails onto the target ship and take down the crew that would stop the Carnivorous Ship from enjoying its meal. The Carnivorous Ship is a gargantuan monstrosity. It is a shape changer and it is of neutral alignment. Has an armor class of 17, 186 hit points, a movement speed of 10 feet, and a swim speed of 60 feet. It has +6 to strength, -2 to dex, +5 to con, -2 to intelligence, +0 to wisdom, and +2 to charisma. It has a whopping +12 to deception, as well as a +5 to perception. It is immune to acid damage and immune to the prone condition. Has blind sight out to 60 feet, dark vision out to 120 feet, and a passive perception of 15. It speaks no languages but understands common, and has a challenge rating of 13. Moving into our abilities, it is amphibious. The Carnivorous Ship can breathe air and water. Drones. Each day at dawn, the Carnivorous Ship produces up to 12 vaguely humanoid drones. Drones share a telepathic link with the Carnivorous Ship and are under its control. A drone uses the statistics of a zombie, except it can't be knocked prone while on the Carnivorous Ship, and can attach itself to the ship as a reaction when the ship moves. The Carnivorous Ship can have no more than 12 drones under its control at one time. And finally, we have Shape Changer. The Carnivorous Ship can use its action to polymorph into a gargantuan ship, such as a galleon, or back into its true amorphous form. Its statistics are the same in each form. Any equipment it is wearing or carrying isn't transformed, it reverts to its true form when it dies. Moving into our actions, we have multi-attack. The Carnivorous Ship makes 2 bite attacks. Bite is a melee weapon attack with +11 to hit, a reach of 10 feet, hits one target, and on average does 22 piercing damage plus 18 acid damage. A lot of damage. We also get spit cannonballs. The Carnivorous Ship spits cannonball-like lumps of indigestible metal at up to 3 points it can see within 100 feet of it. Each creature within 5 feet of a point must make a DC 18 dexterity saving throw, taking on average 18 slashing damage on a failed save or half as much damage on a successful one. And finally, we have Surge. The Carnivorous Ship moves up to 400 feet in a straight line and can move through huge and smaller objects, as if they were difficult terrain. This movement doesn't provoke opportunity attacks. If it moves through a huge or smaller object, the object takes on average 55 bludgeoning damage. If it moves through a ship, the ship's pilot can make a DC 15 wisdom check using navigator's tools, having the damage on a success. Alright, so moving into my initial thoughts on the Carnivorous Ship. Something I feel like is kind of strange is the fact that they're bribable, because ultimately this is a instinctual creature. It doesn't think things through, it's all instinct based. And its instinct is to eat ships. It's to eat wood, metal, rope, all of those things.
That's a 10.
And then how are we bribing them as a captain? Are we letting them take a bite out of our ship? Are we giving them like a gold coin? That's not going to be enough. So the bribable aspect is kind of strange to me. Maybe like our emergency safety buoy boat. you know, maybe we give that away. And that's what we give to the Carnivorous Ship. But it does kind of feel like that's a shoehorned in aspect of this creature and not really well thought out. And speaking of the instinctual nature, we want to keep the tactics for this creature very simple. We don't want to be using our cannonballs to pepper them from afar for long enough for us to tactically move in and then surge at the right moment and then have our little guys run on top. You know, too complicated of tactics for this creature. This creature is going to be direct. It's going to want to get to eating this ship. So it wants to use its bite. That's its nature, is it wants to get in there and use bite. It doesn't want to ram a ship and then leave. It wants to get to chew on that ship. And then everything else comes from that. So it wants to be biting the ship, and if something's stopping it, then we can start talking about other things. So with the plus 12 deception, we know that it's going to want to try fooling to begin. It wants to be seen as a ship, and it wants to be seen as probably a non-threatening ship. It wants to get close before attacking its prey. Once it begins attacking its prey, it's going to start biting the ship instantly and have the crew surge. And it'll keep doing this until the ship's destroyed, unless it is pressured enough that it has to retreat. Or surge is when that would come into play. So surge is actually pretty crazy. First off, the mobility of 400 feet. Like, if this was a super tactical creature, it would just surge back and forth, back and forth. The 400 feet would keep you from being in danger, because at the end of the day, you're going to have 460 feet of movement, and you can just hit and run. It's just actually crazy. Probably a little bit imbalanced. I might actually give this a recharge on a 5 or a 6, just to kind of keep it tamed. But say that it's biting the ship and it's being pressured now, it can surge, doing more damage to the ship and escaping, and if it does enough damage to the ship and it's sinking, it can swing back around and start eating again, because it can actually go underwater as well to feed. So yeah, if it was a smarter creature, it might spit cannonballs and surge over and over again until it's sunk and then go eat. But I don't like playing it that way. I think it's too complicated of tactics for this creature. I like the idea of it chomping down on the ship and there actually being a fight. So what would it use spit cannonballs for? So in my head, it would begin using spit cannonballs defensively. If it was wounded and injured and was retreating and people were chasing it as it was running away, it would spit cannonballs back at the enemies, trying to keep them away from them. So that kind of sums up how I would use their actions, not optimally, but how I would use them with this creature based on their intelligence and their wisdom. But that's kind of like, that's up to a DM's judgment. How would you run the Carnivorous Ship in one of your games? Would you run it tactically complicated, or would you run it similar to how I ran it, and the nuances in between? What would you do specifically? Let me know in the comments down below. We are D&D Daily. We release new D&D content every single day. If that's interesting to you, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace!